Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Is that okay? Great. Well, thanks for being here in what must no doubt be the last week of your school holidays. Thanks to the Immigration Museum for hosting us. As Bruce has said, my name is Annmarie Elijah and I'm from ANU. Pascal has given you the most fantastic amount of material for you to use in relation to the EU in your classroom, so I thought I might focus a little bit more on what makes the European Union a conceptually interesting thing for you to talk about with your students, and I'll be able to skip through some of my presentation because Pascaline has already covered it. Alright, so I want to talk about, first of all, a little bit about why this thing called the European Union is interesting, whether it's unique, and what sort of characteristics we might ascribe to it and then be able to use to talk to students about. The thing is that among academics there's not a lot of consensus about what the European Union actually is. In fact, there's a lot of disagreement. And this is perhaps why it ends up being called a unique political arrangement, because there's not much agreement about what it is or about what it should be. And these things have really never been defined since the outset of the project, which, as we know, is more than 5 decades ago. So the EU has this long, successful history of political and economic cooperation, but in fact, the political leaders have never clearly defined where it is that this project is going. Now, the nature of the European Union has been changing profoundly since its development in 2 main ways. One is through the successive enlargements that Pascaline has already mentioned. So we have moved from 6 founding member states now to 28, and that has made profound changes for the way that the institutional structure of the EU has worked. And at the same time, there have been decisions taken to allocate more and more competences to Brussels or to the institutions of the European Union. And so the way that the organisation works has changed also. So academics refer to these processes as, on the one hand, widening, i.e. to taking more and more members, and on the other hand, deepening, which means to change the nature of the political processes that the EU is seeking to undertake. However, this doesn't resolve the issue of what the European Union actually is. It's not quite an international organisation. If we think for a moment about what the United Nations, for example, is like, the EU is not really along the same lines, and in some ways is politically a far more significant organisation in what it is able to do in relation to its member states and, of course, its own citizens. On the other hand, the European Union is not a state. We do not refer to the government of the European Union. In fact, academics are much more inclined to talk about processes of governance rather than government. So it's not quite a state, even though it has assumed some of the characteristics that we would associate with a state, a nation-state. Now I'll skip over this bit as Pascaline has ably covered it, but in brief, more than 5 decades depends when you like to start the process of integration. Might be at 1951 with the European Coal and Steel Communities. Multiple decades of successful integration, continual change by virtue of a treaty process. So every few years, the member states of the European Union get together, thrash out another treaty which changes profoundly the way that the European Union actually works, and that has been the process by which the European Union has progressed over all these decades. It has, as the 2012 Peace Prize attests, it has been remarkably successful at preventing conflict within Europe, but at the same time the EU is mostly known for its economic achievements, in particular the achievement of the single market and what we call the 4 freedoms. The 4 freedoms being the free movement of goods, capital, people and services. And much of the EU work that we might read about in the papers is actually about the work of completing this single market, which was officially begun in 1957, but given a real boost in the mid-1980s and has gone from strength to strength since that time. And in many ways, the EU is the most advanced case that we know of a single market among states in terms of its regulatory achievements, for example. Now, when we're thinking about what the EU is, it gives us a little bit of a clue as to how to think about it when we see it behaving on the international stage. Again, it's not quite an international organisation, and neither is it quite a state, but it is starting to assume some of the characteristics that we associate with nation states. So, if we think of its behaviour within the World Trade Organisation, for example, where it represents all of its 28 member states and negotiates as though it is one entity, we can see that it's behaving a little bit like a state. In other organisations and in areas that were traditionally in the realm of foreign policy, the EU hasn't progressed quite as far, but it is moving in that direction. So, for example, the EU is now represented in the United Nations alongside the European member states in the United Nations. So we can see how it's starting to exert some interesting characteristics internationally. And that is an interesting way too into thinking about what this organisation or what this entity actually is. So this leads on to what I'm going to call the n=1 puzzle. To cut quite a long theoretical and academic story short, once this interesting process of integration kicked off in Europe, academics, of course, were quick to see that this was an interesting and unexplained process, and to develop theories that might explain that process. There was, of course, no agreement about what exactly it was that drove integration in the first place, or who the main actors would be, and whether or not the nation state would eventually be superseded, for example. But there was a really sizable body of theory developed that might explain this unusual looking thing. And then there was an expectation on behalf of those theorists that those theories could be applied to other parts of the world. Now, the theorists in the end were terribly disappointed because nothing else appeared to spring up around the place that looked remotely like the European Union. So the argument was put forward, here is a new way of that nations can cooperate. This is what it's going to look like. Now we'll just wait for the other examples around the world to follow suit. And then they most inconveniently didn't. So, of course, we know there are other examples of integration around the world, but they do not, in large part, resemble what has happened in the EU. So, again, we return to this question of, well, does this mean what we're dealing with is a unique political entity, or as Jacques Delors once called it, an unidentified political object? Is it only one? So the question is, does n=1, and will we ever see anything like this again internationally? And at that point, I think some of the theorists actually gave up and started just looking at the internal processes of the EU rather than seeking to compare it with what else was going on in the rest of the world, which inconveniently didn't fit the models. Now, from the point of view of the rest of the world, other regions, of course, were doing their own things on their own terms. And there's no shortage of other examples of regionalism or regions. So you will have heard of some of those. Some are more well known than others. You'll mostly know about APEC, which is the one with the shirts, where you see all the leaders in the same shirt. But of course, ASEAN, Mercosur, plenty of other examples. And now we also have lots of governments working towards very complex free trade agreements with each other, which have aspirations in them that look a little bit like some of the things that the European Union has sought to do or is still doing. So, policymakers in other parts of the world have taken some of the ideas from the European Union and used them, And other times they've looked at the example of the European Union and thought, actually, we can't use that idea at all because perhaps we don't want supranational institutions, or perhaps we won't set up our own parliament. Other times, though, you see the language of the European Union kind of appropriated and applied, and perhaps there will be a similar outcome in one policy area, or maybe the language will be used, but the outcome will actually be very different. All of which is coming around to talk about how we might compare the European Union to our own situation and what's going on a little bit closer to home. And my hope here was that you might be able to use this material to make the EU a little bit more of a concrete thing for students. So I always think that Australians have a really great advantage in thinking about the European Union because we understand federation really well. And we wouldn't be so bold as to call the European Union a federation because then people get upset. But we might call it a confederation. And so I think we understand almost intuitively some of the political dynamics that the EU is confronted with all the time. So if we think about the Australian case, we know, for example, that the regular COAG meetings, the sort of meetings of the Australian Prime Minister and all the premiers and chief ministers, they get together in Canberra or some other city and they have a big argument about money. We can think of some of those dynamics as also being part of what is going on in the EU on a pretty regular basis. I always like to think of the council meetings of the EU as being a bit like COAG with 24 languages. So you can see the enormity of the task that the EU leaders have before them in trying to integrate and cooperate across this wide range of policy areas. It's really very complicated. And like I said, I think we have a small insight into that by virtue of being from Australia. I think, do we have New Zealand here as well? Hello. Hello. 3, in fact. 4. Right. Well, the other case then I want to draw your attention to is the extent of cooperation that Australia and New Zealand undertake between the two countries and with the Australian states and territories in quite a complicated arrangement, which is seldom reported on very much. But actually, we've been working on our own single market in this part of the world since 1983, when we signed a very comprehensive agreement. And we're up against a lot of the same issues of integration that the EU faces on a regular basis. So we're also thinking about these things like, what are the terms in which a person can move between countries and work? Will they have superannuation when they get there? Do they have welfare rights? These sorts of issues are exactly the same sorts of issues that European governments are facing when they're trying to work this stuff out in the EU context. But I'll just show you this next slide, not because I want you to read it or memorise it, but that's my shorthand summary of the measures taken across the 4 freedoms, so those same 4 freedoms that are identified as part of the European single market, goods, services, labour and capital. They're the measures that the Australian and New Zealand governments are collaboratively undertaking. So as you can see, it's a lot of stuff. I really just wanted to make the point that integration and economic integration in particular is happening in other parts of the world, but it does not really look exactly the same as what's going on in Europe. But there can be some of the same sorts of outcomes. So that could be one way to go in terms of making what's going on in the European Union a little bit more of a concrete thing to talk about with students if they can see that similar integration problems are being faced in the local context and that actually we do a little bit of cooperation along the same lines with New Zealand. Right, conclusions. How am I doing for time?
Perfect.
Oh, good, thanks, Bruce. Right, I think we can say that the European Union is unique in a number of ways. It's the most developed case we have of integration. It's the most visible case of integration. We don't really have an equivalent, for example, of the European Parliament anywhere else. And this institutional structure distinguishes it both from states but also from other international organisations. The achievements of the European Union are quite remarkable in a lot of ways, it cops a lot of flack, but it's been going for a long time. People have been predicting its demise for a very long time, and yet it's still here. But it's not the only case of integration, and it's not the only way that you can do integration. So we don't naturally import our assumptions about the European Union and apply them to the rest of the world. And I would suggest this tends to work pretty badly, in particular when you apply it to East Asia, where things often just work very differently. Which is not to say we shouldn't compare it, it's just that we shouldn't bring our expectations about things all being the same across different parts of the world. So I'll stop there, and I'll be delighted to take any questions. Thank you.